Okay, this is the intro to the recording for the Friday night Bible study for the 24th day of August, 2018. I'll give the Hebrew calendar date when we go live. We're going live on Facebook Live Sabbath service page, and this recording will go into the archive. And we'll begin just as soon as I get a green light after we press the go live button. All right, we've got the green light. Greetings to those of you watching on Facebook Live for the Friday night Bible study for this 14th day of the 6th month on God's holy sacred calendar. It is the 24th of August, 2018. Now, what are we doing tonight? I'll come back to the date on the Hebrew calendar in a moment. Tonight, Dale, especially for you, since you asked me to do this. I was going to say asked for it, but I hate to use that term because it has kind of a connotation or a meaning to it. Well, you asked for it. But Dale, considering the person I'm speaking to, Dale, I'm just using his first name, Dale's attitude seems to be one that's so pleasant and desirous of holding fast to the truth as God provided and gave it to us by Mr. Herbert Armstrong. That I don't want to say you asked for it. I'm just going to say, hey, this is something for which you asked. That doesn't carry that connotation as much when if you put it in the terms of you asked for it. May I stop and comment for a moment before we go to what Dale asked me to do tonight? Well, rather than leave everybody in too much mystery, let me just say I've got the recording from 1956 when Mr. Armstrong first gave the principle that he elaborated on later in the early and mid-1980s, when he reminded us that none of us, he reminded us in the mid-80s that none of us were members of a certain denomination. Denomination meaning a named corporate name, a business name, as if it were. We'll elaborate on that in a moment. But he goes back to having given that same principle and almost the same exact words, except that the corporate name was changed. So back in 1956, when he was saying Radio Church of God, the same principles exactly that he outlined and that he gave, or even in detail that he, to some great extent, that he gave in 1956 during a Feast of Tabernacles, during what they call a meeting portion of the Feast of Tabernacles, almost as if it were a business meeting, but not so much really. I think some people have mislabeled that. Wait till the recording he was speaking to everybody at the Feast of Tabernacles that year. And then again, although it wasn't a Feast of Tabernacles, but in Pasadena to the headquarters congregation, he did the same thing. Once again, only he did it stronger. He asked everybody to raise their hands and to put them up high if you were members of the worldwide Church of God. And then he told everybody, put your hands down. And he explained why nobody there had ever been a member of the Worldwide Church of God unless at one time you were on its board of directors. All right, I'm getting into it. That's where we're going to go tonight. And I've got the recording of Mr. Armstrong speaking himself from 1956. But I want to apologize, first of all, that we're later than usual, although our starting time was 7:30 Pacific Coast time tonight, which is 2 hours later than I would normally do it, 7:30 Central time. But I'm still, when I tried to come on tonight, I found out, some of our equipment had been wired back together incorrectly and left some cables unwired. I loaned some of our equipment out to a special project we're working on last night. Knocked me off a World Watch last night. I apologize for that too. I'm going to try to get it to where we can handle extra things. The extra thing from last night will lead to something extremely special related to the hymns and music and things. Oh, just wait till I'm able to announce that. I think you'll be happy. Now, I believe because of the way we rewired things, some of the audio problems I have been having with the audio, the microphone on me, we may have resolved that in part, and we may resolve it even further by my going back to a different microphone that we used to use that I took out of circuit and put on the shelf, and we may try that as I move things around and repatch things next week even. Or, I don't know, I may even throw it in the mix tomorrow if I get a chance to listen tonight, and if this thing is still not sounding as hot as it got pretty bad the last few weeks. Some piece of equipment's gone wacko, and I think I may have determined what area that equipment's in by a group patching out of certain things and avoiding, and looping around it, and then seeing if we're still hearing that problem. Some of you called it scrambled, audio or screechy, whatever it was doing. Okay, but I do want to also wish everybody a very happy Sabbath. I'm certainly glad to see it here, even though, sometimes I have to do a lot on the Sabbath with these live streams. It's still very different than what we do during the other part of the week, and just to be able to stop and talk to you on a more personal level, talk to you as brethren, being that this is on a different channel than the Sunday through Thursday night news related to the Bible program, which is on the worldwatch.tv channel. Still all part of the cogtv.org domain. And that stands for Church of God Television. That is not a splinter group that you can join. It's not a group that you can say you're a member of. I mean, I very much welcome those of you who watch on a regular basis the two programs we have, the Sabbath service on the weekends, Friday night Bible study, Friday night, the Sabbath service on the Sabbath, and also the other program, the news related to the Bible and prophecy, Sunday through Thursday night. And in one way, especially that, I have to work a lot harder for that. And some of you know, one of you asked me this week, what's the history, I forgot how you asked me exactly, but what's the history of the program here? Somehow your wording of that question caused me to answer it and let the person know, and I think some of the rest of you that maybe knew would like to know. No, I am not the original host here on either of these programs. The original host was longtime 50-year minister in Alabama, Robert Collins. Now, yes, I was born in Alabama, but when God called me into the church back in 1969 is when I was baptized. I guess he began to call me a couple of years before that as he was working on me and testing me and seeing whether he would choose me or not after he kind of whet my appetite with a calling, and after I banged on his door saying, "Tell me, where is that church?" After I read Christ's words in Matthew 18, verse 16, 16, verse 18. Well, which one of those is that? It's one way or the other. It's either Matthew 18, 16 or Matthew 16, 18. While I'm live, I'm having a problem remembering exactly. But I can quickly flip to, first of all, Matthew 16, see if it's in verse 18. Yeah, it is, verse 18, where Christ said unto Peter, I say also unto you that you art Peter, and upon this you are Peter, Petra, little rock, and on this rock, big rock, I will build my church. And when I saw that verse, when I was looking and looking and looking to try to figure out several things, what are we doing here on this earth? And then when I saw that, I said, okay, if you will build your church, where is it? And I said, I'm pretty sure it's not this church I grew up in that well, not at that point. My dad later hauled me off to the preacher of the church I grew up in, and he had seen that where I was getting some answers from after God answered my prayer, after I pleaded with him for 3 weeks to show me, where is your church? After he opened up a broadcast to me, and then I was able to write in for the Plain Truth magazine and booklets and articles, and of course, coming to my house where I lived with my family, and my dad would see the mail. I think he probably even overheard some of the broadcast I was listening to. And he hauled me off to the local Baptist preacher. And he caught it before I did. My original questions had nothing to do with the Sabbath. You know, God showed me that later, but got me to look at it early on because of my dad checking out what I was listening to, very much reading and attaching myself to, and was able to spend a lot of time on after God caused my car to stop running. And the job I held as assistant city manager for the Alabama Theater Operating Company, part of the ABC television network. It was owned by them at the time. I was the house manager of the Alabama Theater and the assistant city manager for the whole citywide theater operation, which included not only the Alabama Theater, but the Ritz Theater, and which is, the Alabama Theater is still there. It's quite a showplace of the South, and it's still used for more than movie theaters. In fact, it's not so much just a movie theater anymore. It's used more for they do show certain movies, I think, once a week, and then it's used for a lot of special things because it's auditorium style. Even a very incredible design auditorium, has one of the big pipe organs with the keyboard, the multi-keyboard for the pipe organ that comes up from out of the pit, and incredible sound. I've been into the big rooms where the huge motors that provide the wind for for all those horns, for a pipe organ, for all those pipes, I guess I should say. Some of those are pretty tall pipes. I think some of them are 32, 64 feet tall, huge, and rooms full of pipes. And anyway, my car stopped running, and we lived out in a country area which wasn't near any bus routes, nowhere near a bus route. I mean, maybe 10 miles or so from the nearest bus. And I think the family maybe had one car beside my car, and Dad would use that for work hours, and it just wouldn't have worked to even got me to a bus stop because of the way his hours worked. So I called my boss and said, hey, my car stopped running. And my boss said, well, the military's already called you twice for your, once for your exam and once for something else. They said, next time they call you, you're going. So he says, I'll go ahead, Stephen, and put you down for military leave. There was a draft on then, and the law was when a man left work because of the military draft or going into the military, when he got out of the service, he could bump for his job back. He could come back to that employer, and the last man hired had to be laid off so the man coming back from the military could have a job back in the company. So he said, I'll go ahead and put you down for military leave, and that way when you get out, you can come back here and bump for your job back when you get out. And he liked me. He wanted me. He would have liked to have had me back. As it was, though, when I got out in Miami, Florida. God opened up a job to me at a television station doing exactly what I wanted to do. I'd just come into the church, got out on a hoop jumping situation to get out on a CO. And I had to stand up about the Sabbath. I was threatened with the Marine brig when I told them one Friday morning I wouldn't be there that Friday night. And they said, well, if you're not here, Marine brig. I said, well, sir, I don't want to go to the Marine Brig, but if that's the way it is, you might as well take me now. You don't need to wait till tonight, because I'm telling you now, I won't be there. And I even went this far, because the man he kept repeating, being the Marine Brig, if you don't show up tonight. I even went so far as so that he would understand ahead of time. We didn't need to wait all day to that night for me to just not come into that duty. I said, sir, if you're going to send me to the Marine Brig, I put my hands out in front of me and crossed my hands and said, you might as well send me to the brig right now and assign somebody else who will come in here tonight, because when nobody's on duty tonight, sir, it's on your head, not mine. I'm telling you now, I won't be there. Marine Brig, no Marine Brig, you might as well send me now. I don't know if they've ever had anybody be as adamant as I was. I wasn't trying to be nasty about it, but I was firm. And, sir, I don't want to go to the Marine Brig, sir, but if that's the way it's going to be, you might as well send me now. I put my hands out and cross them. Like, here they are. Go ahead and put the cuffs on me. You might as well send me now, because I'm telling you now, sir, I won't be there tonight. And when nobody's on that duty, it's on your head, not mine, because I'm telling you now, there's no question, sir. I will not be there. And for 2 hours, at least, back and forth, we went with that same thing with the guy. I hope you don't mind my telling you this. I hope this is even helpful to you a little bit. Before we play Mr. Armstrong, warm you up, give you a chance to get tuned in. I'm later than usual. Hopefully some of you are finding it. And, one or two of you I promised to let know. I hope, I hope there's something going on out there where you can see that, yes, I'm here. Hang on just 1 second. What's this crazy thing doing? But that, and that commanding officer that was in charge, who was doing that to me, was only temporarily filling in for our regular officer, who had already agreed to let me off, because he understood I was applying for a CO, and part of my religious thing was that I couldn't work Friday night sunset to Saturday night sunset, so he'd agreed to that. And before he left for his 30 days of leave, the regular, not the commanding officer, but the officer over me, the captain over our department, the radio department, before he took his 30-day leave, he set up the entire schedule for all of us that are under his department. He set up the schedule with me not, scheduled to work any Friday night after sunset to Saturday sunset. And but the chief petty officer in our department and the temporary officer over our department, a red-haired guy just out of officer training school and a red-haired Catholic, he and the chief petty officer decided to put me through a test Thursday night, just the day before the Friday night that's in question here. They changed the schedule and had the guard shack watching for me when I came back on base. I had that day off. Thursday was one of my off days. When I came back, the guard shack was instructed to arrest me. And it was just a temporary arrest, just arrest me and escort me over to the radio shack where I worked. We were an air station that sent aircraft out to fly patrols south of Miami, and some of our patrols went between Florida and Cuba. We flew backup for the Air Force. We only flew to 12 miles out from Cuba. At the altitude we were flying, lower altitude, Coast Guard. But the Air Force jets that we were backup for, they were way up there. And they would fly right over the middle of Cuba and take pictures every day. And one day I got the flash message that had to get to the White House to Washington within 10 minutes from the time the person that sends it coded. I have to uncode it from the way they send it according to our local code, and then I have to recode it for a special flash teletype machine that goes to Washington, D.C., and You have 10 minutes to do it in. And the message, I can tell you now, it was top secret then, but it was top secret for 20 years. Well, it's been way past 20 years. And the message was there was a Russian vessel headed toward Cuba with long, metallic, cylindrical, cone-shaped on one end, blunt on the other end, cylinders, metal cylinders on this ship headed toward Cuba. Well, you know, what would be inside of a long metallic cylinder thing, cone-shaped on one end, blunt on the other, except missiles? And so, I mean, you know, that's very obvious from the message, but they described it very factually. That, you know, they were inside these cylinders, cone-shaped on one and blunt on the others. You know, in the air, the Coast Guard the Coast Guard planes could see that in the waters below them. So, boom, the officer on that flight sends a flash message, and I have to get it to Washington, D.C., and then I'm out of the loop. Once I did my part in sending that message, you know, I don't know what happened with the rest of it, but I don't think those missiles ever got to Cuba. Washington did something to intervene and turn that around. But anyway, what was I telling you that for? I was in the Coast Guard. I was telling you because I got scheduled to work on a Friday night. When I got arrested Thursday night, I was escorted by one of the guards to the Radio Shack room. I was just telling you, one of my Radio Shack experiences, and we worked right next to the officers that did the flight coordinating and kept track. The planes would call into us every 15 minutes and give their coordinates, and we'd give those to the officer on the flight deck thing with his board, and he would pinpoint each plane and where it was every 15 minutes. So he knew exactly where our aircraft from our airbase was. But I loved that job. I enjoyed it. And then when I learned military service and war, I needed to get out. I applied for the CO. So even before that, I already told them, look, I can't work Friday night, sunset, Saturday night, sunset. My boss said, no problem. I can work the schedule, so we worked that around. But the chief petty officer did not like that at all. And I don't know what was such a big deal on Friday night to him. He was a family man. I think he had some children. But chief petty officer didn't like it. But he was under this other officer that already agreed to give that to me. But this officer is on his vacation. He's on 30 days leave in Hawaii. And so now the chief petty officer talks to the new temporary officer over our department while the regular officer, who's coming back, but he's just away on 30 days leave, he talks him into, let's change the schedule and put Stephen on Friday night. Now, both fellows, interestingly, maybe this relates, maybe not, but they were both Catholic. The chief petty officer was Catholic. The temporary officer, just out of officer training school, assigned to our base, red-haired Catholic, was a Catholic guy also. And one of the things during the argument that the new temporary lead guy till our regular guy comes back, one of the things he said to me during our 2 hours back and forth was, Gilbreath, I'm a good Catholic, and and Sunday is the day of worship for the Catholics. He said, I'm a good Catholic, and I work when I have Sunday shifts. I work Sundays. And God just gave this to me, friends. I came right back with, sir, I'll work Sunday too, but I won't work on God's Sabbath. And as you might guess, I've got a red light in the studio that tells me when my microphone is on. I passed around it temporarily, though, because I think that may be part of the loop that was causing our sound scrambling. So I'm taking that out of the loop for the moment. I bypassed it. And I only really need that on the nights we do the news, because I'm turning the mic on and off. Every time we play a news clip, I turn the mic off so that it won't pick up anything while the news clip is playing. And then sometimes I've missed the button or forgot to turn it back on, so I got a big red light and some other cone lights that tell me, hey, your mic's on or your mic's off. But his face turned as red as my red light would normally turn, with anger when I said that, and he was also angry about a few other things. And at one point, he finally just says, all right, Gilbreath, stay here. I'm going up and see the commanding officer. He storms out of there angry, which At what point was it? What I might have been that one. Might have been that one. I said, "Sir, I'll work Sunday too, but I won't work on God's Sabbath." And I don't know if it was then or not, but at one point he says, "Gilbreath, stay here. I'm going up to see the commanding officer." Now he comes down. He's even more angry than when he was before he left, but he had to subdue it and put it in check. And he even told me that some of the things that he was telling me when he came back from the commanding officer was because the commanding officer ordered him to tell me this or that. And the couple of things he told me was, well, let me see, did I tell you everything I needed to tell you? Because he comes back and he says, all right, Gilbreath, first of all, the commanding officer ordered me to tell you, and in other words, he was saying, I wouldn't dare tell you this or do this myself on my own, but I'm ordered to tell you that the commanding officer will not allow me to work you or schedule you to work from Friday night sunset to Sabbath sunset. So they understood, or Saturday, as he put it, from Friday night sunset to Saturday sunset. They understood when the Sabbath was because either they already understood it or because of, my having explained that to the former officer and in our discussions, I can't work Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. So he comes back and says, not only has the commanding officer ordered me to tell you that I cannot schedule you to work between Friday sunset and Saturday sunset. So in other words, boom, I don't have to worry about Friday night, that night. They're going to find somebody else for that. So boom, that potential ordeal of throwing me in the Marine brig is over. But there's more to the story. I was just baptized 2 days before that after I told the local minister in Miami that the Coast Guard had turned down my leave request, and I had leave coming to me, and my leave would not have been impacted by an officer's leave, the officer over us. My leave only affected other enlisted men. Some of you know what I mean by all that. And there was no other enlisted man taking leave from our department at the time I requested it for the Feast of Tabernacles in 1969, which started that Friday night in question, the one they wanted to schedule me to work. But they didn't let me know until 2 days before Friday. I'd requested leave 2, 3, 4 weeks before, but they didn't let me know that they turned me down until just a couple of days before that. I'm assuming they're going to grant it because nobody else could ask for leave. And I was working part-time beside my full-time Coast Guard. I was working part-time at a Broadway department store in Miami because then they gave you 25% off all purchases of clothing. And I thought, great. I bought me a new suit and some new shirts. I had me, at that time, I got me different colored shirts for every day of the feast. I got me a light blue, light yellow, light pink, light green, light lavender, and different colored ties to match my shirt and suit, and a hanky to match all that. So, I got all that 25% discount. So I'm really looking forward to the feast to dress nicely, even though I'm going to camp. And it poured down stormy, raining during that feast. Man, a lot of my clothes got wet inside that tent. But I always managed I was able to hang the new stuff for each day so that it didn't get wet. So anyway, I already told you I made it to the feast, but they turned me down. And so 2 days before, and I called the minister and said, Mr. Henson, I said, I just got news that they've turned down my leave request for attending the feast. I'd made the mistake, as he thought. He said, did you put the reason on your leave request? Well, I said, yeah, I'm to attend a religious festival up in Jekyll Island. And he said, well, he probably shouldn't have given them all the facts, Sure enough, somebody in the personnel department who was very jealous and hated anybody who enlisted into the Coast Guard. You don't get drafted in the Coast Guard. I was able to enlist. You enlist on your own and then you apply for a CO. He just thought that was the most outrageous thing in the world, and tried to embarrass me one night at the 9 o'clock snack hour. When I walk in, he's having a beer, and there's like 100 men or more in the mess hall at the 9 o'clock snack hour, at night. It's a very popular thing for all the guys to go down for that. And everybody's chanting away, and it's noisy in there, but as soon as I walk in, the guy from the personnel department who turned me down, he hollers out, "Well, if it isn't old Gilbreath walking in, the CO!" And he starts bellowing about how you have to enlist in the Coast Guard, but now he's applying for a CO, and he's just raving with anger, showing his anger about my having done that. Now the whole base knows, and he's applying for a CO to get out. Now the whole base knows I'm applying for a CO, and it's kind of like there was another fellow came into our church maybe 3 or 4 months before I apply, who got out at the same base, and it's a relatively small Coast Guard base, base, Coast Guard. And Mr. Henson said, well, if any more from here go, they're gonna hate our church for taking all their guys. They're gonna wonder what's up. But the other guy just disappeared quietly. He, no big deal was made out of it. But the whole base knew about mine because of this personnel guy. But thankfully, I had a friend in the Coast Guard, a little guy that I didn't realize how much he liked me and was a friend. And he's a small guy who was a black belt in, at that time, karate, which was the big thing. He walks over to the guy from the personnel department, sitting there bellowing out with his beer in his hand about old Gilbreath, the CO there. The whole mess hall just became absolutely quiet as a mouse. While he's bellowing this out, so all eyes are on him and on me to see what's going to happen next. Well, the little guy goes over to the personnel guy sitting in his chair, grabs him by his shirt, and pulls his face up on his face, and he says, "Gilbreath is my friend. You don't talk about Gilbreath that way." Boom! And he pops the guy back down. Now, the little black belt guy who did that was a lot smaller than this big guy in the chair. But the big guy in the chair, his face looked like his face had been smashed in the wall. All the little guy did was grab him by the shirt and the collar, pull him in his face, and say it loudly wherever the whole room, which was quiet, could hear that, and then thumps him back down in the chair. And the guy, he left after that. He sat there for a few seconds and looking like his face had been bashed in the wall. And then he just gets up and storms on out of there. Well, I stayed. Everybody started talking again, and I acted like nothing had happened. I went on through the line and got my little sandwich and all this, and thanked my buddy for taking up for me the way he did. But then it's interesting. Some of the base guys just said, "Oh, you're applying for CO? Yeah, well, okay, hope you get it." That was the reaction of a lot of them. And of course, I'm sure there were others who had the attitude like this guy. But this was the guy who he was able to turn down my leave request. And so I called Mr. Henson, and Mr. Henson said, well, I think you better be baptized. You're gonna, for what you're probably gonna be facing here on out, you need God's Spirit. This was on Wednesday. I had no idea what was going to be coming up on Friday morning, 2 days after I was baptized. But Mr. Henson seemed, maybe by inspiration, knew I would need God's Spirit in a special way and said, "You're probably going to need God's Spirit for what's coming up after this." He didn't know exactly what was coming up, but somehow maybe God inspired him to know something might be coming up. And sure enough, Thursday night they scheduled me to work Friday night. Friday I go in and spend 2 hours back and forth. Marine Brig, if you're not here tonight, will serve. I don't want to go to Marine Brig, but if that's the way it's going to be, then you might as well send me now, because I'm telling you now, there's no question about it. I will not be here tonight on duty. So he storms out to the commanding officer, and again, there's 2 things now the commanding officer ordered to tell me. One was what I just told you, that he was ordered. He could not schedule me to work Friday sunset to Sabbath sunset. But the other thing was, he said, and the commanding officer told me to tell you that because you had requested leave, that he looked into he looked into your personnel file, and he saw that you had requested leave to be off to attend a religious event in Georgia that starts tonight. And he ordered me to tell you, and boy, you could see the gulp on his face and still the redness in his face. He didn't want to tell me this. He didn't want that to have happened. I think he was sad that he made an issue out of trying to work me Friday night, because they already had one on me by having turned down my leave request, and that would have still been left turned down had this other thing not happened. Let me tell you what the local minister said to me when I called him, and then he said, I think you better be baptized for what you may be facing. He said, you will have to stay behind. You won't be able to come up and attend the feast because of their not letting you leave. He said, so just don't work the high Sabbaths, but that year, the high Sabbaths were also the weekly Sabbaths, because the feast started on a Friday night that year in 1969. So that Friday night was not only a regular Sabbath, it was going to be the high Sabbath, the annual holy day, the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so the magical blessing, by my being willing to stand up and say, if it's going to be Marine Brig, and part of the 2 hours would be the temporary officer of our department telling me how bad and how awful the Marine Brig is. They'd send me to the U.S. Marines Brig down in Homestead, I think it was, because the Coast Guard didn't have brigs of their own, but the Marines did, for military people that misbehave. And he told me about how they make you drag these big chains hooked to a ball through the mud, and how they beat you with this and beat you with that and spit on you and just treat you horrible. I was thinking, in one way I was thinking, boy, I'm brand new in the church and I get to be treated like the Apostle Paul and some of the others that were beaten. And in one crazy way, I was looking, and some of my enemies are going to love this one. They love to write up creepy junk about me, so dill pickle, have fun with this one. They threatened all this stuff they would do to me in the Marine Brig, and I was actually, in one way, looking forward to it, trying to have an optimistic, positive attitude. If this was going to happen to me, I was saying, boy, how come I get the privilege, brand new in the church, to be punished in this way for keeping the Sabbath? I thought, wow, great, bring it on. In one way, I was saying that, but I also was realistically saying, well, God, if you would intervene for me, like Daniel, you did for Daniel in the lion's den and in the fiery furnace, I would appreciate it, because I really don't want to go through that. And I'm very glad about the way it turned out, that I didn't have to go to the Marine Brig, because and that it wound up giving me my leave for the Feast of Tabernacles, because that temporary officer who was ordered to tell me he couldn't work me on the Sabbath also had to tell me that the commanding officer ordered me to tell you. In other words, I wouldn't be telling you this, Gilbreath, for the life of me if I weren't under an order from the commanding officer to tell you this. The commanding officer ordered me to tell you that he personally looked into your personnel file and saw that your leave was turned down, and he said, there's no reason Gilbreath's leave should have been turned down because he wants to attend a religious festival. Who did that? And he found out that guy that spoke nasty about me in the mess hall that one evening was the guy who turned down my leave request. And he said some things about that guy, and you tell that guy that I, the commanding officer, has personally intervened, and the commanding officer, have approved his leave, and you tell him that he is free to leave for that religious event he wants to attend as of this moment. And I tell you what, brethren, friends, the moment the temporary commanding officer said those words to me, that he was ordered to tell me that as of that moment I was free, the commanding officer had approved my leave, and I was free to leave as of that moment for that event, I snapped to attention, saluted that officer that was telling me that, and I said, sir, thank you, sir. Put my salute down, and I snapped a 180 with my feet. and marched out of there at a fast and rapid pace, having just been told the commanding officer has approved my leave. I was free to leave as of that moment, that they couldn't work me on the Sabbath. That meant, hey, I had my leave for the next, whatever I asked for, 2 weeks, 10 days, 10 days, 2 weeks. I think I asked for 2 weeks to be covered, to cover time after the feast. But as I'm leaving, somebody told me, hey, Gilbreath, when you get back, we want you to finish that request for CO as fast as you can. And they got everything scheduled that I needed to have scheduled. You had to be interviewed by a chaplain. I thought that would be a breeze. And you had to be interviewed by a psychiatrist. I thought, oh no, they're going to find out I'm crazy or something. No, the psychiatrist told me, you're fine. Put in that you're fine. I thought, great, I passed the psychiatrist thing. Then I was scheduled for the chaplain, and I thought that'd be a breeze. Yeah, chaplain will understand. I point out some scriptures from the Bible. That chaplain was so angry and argued with me, and even said, after I answered his questions clearly, and I mean, what should have been convincingly too, except somebody with blinders on, they're not going to see it. And he was so angry, the chaplain was so angry, he said, this is after the feast now, he said, I'm not going to write a report for you. And I thought, well, wait a minute, I need that report to be able to get out. And so and they sent me to a Air Force base where they had a chaplain. Our Coast Guard base didn't have a chaplain. They sent me to a big Air Force base, which was miles away. And I get there, have 2 or 3 hours with the chaplain, and then the chaplain says, I'm not going to write the report. And I said, sir, and I figured it wouldn't matter if he said something bad, him being a chaplain. I could just say, well, he doesn't believe the same way I believe. So, there you are. I said, sir, you have to write a report even if you say something bad about me. And I knew I needed the report, so I was trying to encourage him, say all the bad things you want to me about me, sir, but, you have to write the report. He said, I am not going to write a report for you trying to get out on a CO. That's just totally blah, blah, uncalled for. So I go back to the Coast Guard base, and I report in to the personnel office where you put your CO request, and explain to them, I said, sir, I'm just back, and the chaplain there said he's not going to submit a report. Is there another chaplain you might send me to? And they said, no, we're going to call that chaplain. And so they called him, and they rescheduled me with him, and they told him that the rules are you have to write a report. Doesn't matter what you say, but you have to write a report. It's military procedure. It's a military rule. And the chaplain who's part of the military has to follow that. So when I got back to him, he explained, all right, they called me and they said, I have to write a report. It's probably not going to be good, Gilbreath, but let me ask you some more questions, blah, blah, blah. And it was a horrible couple of hours again with him. He was trying to convert me. But I held firm, and I had answers for him. And he didn't like that at all. I said, all right, I have to write the report, but I'm not saying anything good about you. But they approved my getting out anyway. But after I got word that I was able to, the commanding officer had intervened and I could attend the Feast of Tabernacles 1969, I had a brand new 69 GTO I had just bought. I'm living on a Coast Guard base. The barracks is provided and the food is provided, and I get this paycheck of whatever amount it was. It was enough to get a bank loan for a brand new 1969 GTO. I bought that before I wrote for the visit for the Sabbath and before the minister tells me about military service and war. I thought I was going to have to finish out another couple of years in the Coast Guard. I was in there, I think, 2.5 years when I got out. I think I was on a 4-year enlistment, and so I got out a 1.5 years early. So I thought, well, while I'm here, it'll pay for the GTO, and I had fun driving it. My days off, I enjoyed going down to the beach in Miami. Me and a guy that worked at the Miami headquarters of the Coast Guard, we'd meet up at the beach, and he and I, we'd talk on the teletype together, and he was at the radio department communications center in Miami headquarters. I was out at Opelika Air Base, and we got along on the teletype, and we'd make arrangements. Hey, let's go to this beach. And I'd zoom down there in the GTO and meet up. We'd have some fun on the beach. So I drive my GTO, break it in, top speed, on the way to Jekyll Island. And when I got there, one of the deacons says, well, it was late at night when I got there. He said, well, what took you so long? I explained to him what happened. He said, well, we were praying for you up here. We knew God would intervene. And I'm sure that their prayers helped that situation a whole lot to get the commanding officer involved the way he got involved, instead of some character in the personnel department who would have said, yeah, let's go ahead and send him to the Marine brig. If the guy had gone to the personnel guy instead of, that was upset with me at the mess hall and who turned down my leave, instead of going to the commanding officer, the personnel guy would have probably said, and may have had the power to do it, let's just send Gilbreath off to the brig. He would have loved that. But no, the commanding officer got involved. So I thank that deacon and those guys for their prayers. And then I said, and he was really joking me when he said, what took you so long? Or kind of joking. But I told him about that whole interview I went through. And then I tagged the comment on there saying, well, sir, I did 120 miles an hour most of the way up here on that turnpike from Miami to into Georgia, wherever the turnpike ends, that then you had to take highway roads. And the deacon, oh man, he scolded me for that. And I'm brand new in the church, and a young guy. What was I? Maybe 19, 20. I was somewhere in there at that time. And he scolds me and he says, all right, Gilbreath, God may have looked the other way. I told him how state troopers had pulled people over on the left and on the same side of the road as me. Their light's still going. I didn't even slow down. They said, well, God must have blinded their eyes. He said, but on the way home, this is a warning to you. God will not have his angels with you. You need to obey man's speed laws. And he quoted some scripture about how we are to obey the ordinances of man. So I got lectured about that. I really did do 120 some of the way up there, because I thought, I'm going to God's feast, man. I'm getting up there. And it was, even at that speed, it was still 9:30 in the evening before I got there, and I didn't know where the camp was, where I was going to stay. I didn't want to wake everybody up late at night, and people were still up 9:30 when I got there in the evening that Friday night. I missed the opening night. I missed the opening night talk thing because I'm still driving at 120 miles an hour on the way up. But all right, I don't mean to. Listen, we are to obey man's speed laws, so I got away with that then, but I don't want to set any example of things we should not be doing. So shame on Stephen for doing 120. But I was happy that I was very thankful I could attend the Feast of Tabernacles that year, my first year, and be granted the leave while I'm in the military to do it, and not have to be spending that time in the Marine brig. So, dear God, thank you very much for that. Now, let's talk about what the subject is that relates to this audio that I have that, Dale, you wanted to hear. I hope you got word and you're with us, or at least you can catch this in the archive by the recording, and maybe I can give you a clue that if you advance the recording, if you're listening by recording, I'll try to tell you this if you didn't watch live. You could advance this up to about the 45-minute mark in this recording, and then pick up from here where I'm going to talk about this subject related to this guy that's got a T-shirt on that says Body of Christ and a whole bunch of arms sticking off his body to represent, each arm supposed to represent about 200 splinter groups. And one of those arms is broken off the body. Well, we'll play this recording in just a moment, but let me pull this. See, that's screen number 3. Let me pull this screen full forward. Let's see, is this going to work? Yeah, our closed captions are going to the top. Yeah, and our closed captions, for those of you who are hard of hearing, are working. And I know this chart's a little bit busy. I would like to have it redesigned and simplified. I do have another one that's kind of simple. The other one I have, let me go ahead and pop that up for a moment, is this one that just real simple, that says Body of Christ with one sick human head just prior to scattering. Now this refers to the Church of God maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years after Mr. Armstrong died, when the head of the church began to have some apostate ideas he started throwing at us about you could play golf on the Sabbath, and then gave the infamous grace versus law sermon in Georgia, and we wound up that in that congregation the church was pretty much almost split down the middle between grace and or law, and really, it's when you come down to the way it really is, it's not grace or law, it's grace and law. We are to keep God's law, and yet we're very thankful, most of us, I know I certainly am, that God is a God of grace, his mercy endures forever, because even as we try to keep God's law, I think most of you know, you stumble here and there, and even find out sometimes years down the road into your process of conversion that you had this secret little sin you didn't even know you had, and that was a sin. But when you do like David did and ask God, show me my secret sins, wham! And God, please do it with mercy. God shows you some of these things, and one thing we learned after 40 years of the church keeping Pentecost on Monday was that verse 15 included a word in the King James Version translation and in all the translations that existed back from 1927 forward for several years, that is not in the original Hebrew text. The word from, that preposition is not there. And even the scholars on the New King James Version admitted, Mr. Armstrong, you're right. That we shouldn't be using that word from. That makes it interpret out wrong. If we used any preposition there, it should be beginning with, as Mr. Armstrong explained it to them, and they agreed. And they said, Mr. Armstrong, you're right. The head of the chairman of that editing group said, I'm going to make sure that we make that change before we print it. That was the New Revised Standard Version, I believe, that chairman that said that. One or the other, New King James or New Revised Standard. But then when they printed their new version, there was the word from in there again. So God left that, and unless you're being called, it's a mystery. If God calls you to his true church, then through his apostle for the true church, you would know, oh, okay, there's an error in this translation and all of the translations of the Bible that existed then. In Leviticus 23, verse 15, just as there is an error in Acts 12, verse 1 regarding Passover being translated there, the word Pascha, which is the word Passover, being translated intentionally wrongly in that instance as Easter. That's in Acts 12, and one of the verses, I think it's in verse 4 of Acts 12. And I'll just read that one. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison, delivered him to four quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter, says the King James Version. But the original Greek word there is Pascha, meaning expressly, specifically Passover. So an intentional mistranslation, intending, as they mistranslated it, after Easter, to bring him forth to the people. That's Acts 12:4. And in Leviticus 23, verse 15, the word from is not in the original Hebrew. And if you use good English grammar, if you count from something, where it says, and you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread, which morrow works out to be the wave sheaf day. If you count from that day, from the day you brought the sheaf of wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Well, Mr. Armstrong understood English grammar meant if you count from something, you count from it. You exclude it when you start to count. It's day 0. So then the next day is 1, and you wind up with number 50 being on a Monday. However, that conflicts with and contradicts what is said in verse 16. But if you operate from the basis of what the instruction is in verse 15, most people would just stop right there and say, okay, we count that out from the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread, from the day you bought the wave sheaf offering, count from that day, you come out on a Monday for 50. However, again, that it contradicts the instruction provided in verse 16 of Leviticus 23, which says, even unto, and it's the same language, for counting unto the morrow after the Sabbath, in verse 15, counting from the morrow after the Sabbath. It says in verse 16, unto the morrow after the seventh Sabbath. Well, the morrow, in verse 15, the morrow after the Sabbath, it says count from, the wave sheaf day is a Sunday, is the first day of the week, the morrow after the Sabbath, the first day of the week. So when you get to verse 16, if you're following the same grammatical pattern, you're going to see a conflict. It says, even to the morrow after the seventh Sabbath shall you number 50 days. Oh, so that means the morrow after the seventh Sabbath is going to be, and the word Sabbath, if you look it up in the original Hebrew, is Shabbat. There's a word for weeks, so you can't say an idiomatic expression here is meaning just 7 Monday through Sunday weeks. No, it's Sabbath day. So it's got to be a Sunday through Sabbath week, because the rules of transliteration in languages says you can't figure something to be an idiomatic expression for another word if that other word exists in the language. And weeks, Shabua. In Hebrew, the word for weeks is Shabua. If God had wanted to say you can make the week other than first day through Sabbath style of week, he would have said, unto the morrow after the seventh Shabua. And it would have been translated weeks, because the word Shabua means expressly weeks, unless they did what they did in Acts 12:4 and purposely mistranslate it. But the Hebrew word used in verse 16 is Shabbat. And even to the morrow after the seventh Shabbat, after the seventh Sabbath day. And it's going to mean, if you want to have an idiomatic expression, it can't mean anything other than a Sunday through Sabbath week. So 7 weeks of Sundays through Sabbath, and the morrow after the end of those 7 weeks of Sunday through Sabbath, it's going to be another Sunday. So it's clarified, it's made plain in verse 16. If you count it the way verse 15 says it, you're in conflict with what verse 16 says. And because being in Ambassador College in Pasadena in those years before God inspired Mr. Armstrong to change it, for 3 years I was keeping Pentecost on both a Sunday and a Monday. Monday to be in tune with everybody else and under God's leadership, under his leader. And on Sunday, because I was reading verse 16 and saying, God, there's a problem here. Either I'm misunderstanding something because of verse 16, and if I'm screwing that around some way, straighten me out. On the other hand, if that means what I think it means and what it, to me, plainly says, then would you please correct all of us from the top down, from your servant, Mr. Armstrong, down. And I didn't make any big stink about it. I went to one person only. I went to the head of our dorm, who was also a student, but I'm a freshman, he's a senior. And I said, Russ, I'm going to tell you his last name, but I said, his first name was, in fact, Russ. I said, Russ, right after one of our forums or assemblies, when Mr. Armstrong had been going through things, and he went through, verse 15 and how we count Pentecost, I said, something's not squaring up here. I said, would you explain to me why I think this should be on a Sunday? He said, hey, you're not the first one to come up with that. And he mentioned Mr. Cole. Mr. Raymond Cole, he said, had been to Mr. Armstrong about that 20 years ago. I said, oh, well, interesting. Well, how come we didn't change it then 20 years ago? He said, well, Mr. Cole walked away convinced by Mr. Armstrong that it should be Monday. I said, well, what was the arguments he used? Well, we don't know that. We don't know that much. And I never could. I looked into Mr. Raymond Cole's writings whole lot, and I never could see what he did. But since he became convinced we should keep it on Monday, but he had gone to Mr. Armstrong, and he was an evangelist, I said, and even Russ said, he's not listening, he's not going to listen to any of the rest of us. I thought, yeah, especially me, a freshman. You go talk to him, Russ. No, I didn't say that to Russ, because Russ was real quick to say he was able to anticipate that I might say that, and he said to me, Stephen, I'm a senior, and I want to graduate. And in other words, and Mr. Cole already been to Mr. Armstrong about this. And in other words, this is a hot potato you bringing up here, Steve. You ain't getting me in trouble over it. I'm not going to make any stink on it. And it was kind of like the way he put it to me, even though he didn't use those exact words. He did say, I'm a senior and I want to graduate, Steve. Mr. Cole already been there. Mr. Armstrong wasn't convinced from Mr. Cole, Mr. Raymond Cole. And I got the message. If he didn't get convinced from him, he's certainly not going to listen to me. I'm not even sure I'm right. I'm just saying verse 16 looks like it should be on a Sunday. And I checked the Hebrew and everything. And after checking the Hebrew, I said, it really looks like it should be on a Sunday, on the first day of the week. So, and seeing Russ's reaction and hearing about that, somebody already been Mr. And he wanted to graduate, I thought, best thing you could do is keep your mouth shut, except in the prayer closet. And I pounded it away on the prayer closet. I'd say, God, if I'm wrong, show me where I'm wrong. And if not, show all of us. Correct the whole church on it. Correct all of us. And it didn't happen right away. Every year for 3 years I had to pray that between 71 and 74. And then I was sitting in the forum when Mr. Armstrong announced that we'd be changing it. Spent a whole hour explaining it to the student body before he explained it the following Sabbath to the headquarters church congregation. And sure enough, there were some people who rebelled and said, well, Mr. Armstrong just made a mistake. Pentecost, God revealed to Mr. Armstrong, Pentecost should be on Monday. No, he didn't. Mr. Armstrong explained it himself. He explained that God revealed to him that we should keep the annual Sabbaths. But he came up with keeping it on Monday based on Leviticus 23, verse 15, which is, wrongly translated with the word that has the word from inserted in there that's not in the original Hebrew. And if any word's going to be inserted, it should have been prepositional words like beginning with the wave sheaf day, the morrow after the Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread. And if it had been put that way, it would have matched up, harmonized with verse 16, where it says, even unto the morrow after the seventh Sabbath day shall you number 50. Because then the count would have come out if you begin with the wave sheaf day as number 1. And really, you're counting from the Sabbath within the days of unleavened bread. That's the target, 0 Sabbath. You're counting from that 50 days. And begin the count with the wave sheaf day as day 1. Wave sheaf day is part of the 50 days of Pentecost. And it's also considered a feast of weeks, so it's 7 weeks, and as soon as the 7 weeks are complete, then the adjoining day, the following day after the 7 weeks, is Pentecost itself, the count 50 day. And the word means count 50, so you don't just multiply 7 times 7 and come up with 49. That would blow the word Pentecost. The word Pentecost itself means, penta means 50, cost means count, so it's 50 count, or said the other way, count 50. You count 50 days. It's a 50-day count. Penta, 50, cost, count. So it is 50, not 49. It's Feast of Weeks, 7 weeks, and the morrow after, the end of 7 weeks, is Pentecost. All right, now that's a different subject, but for 40 years, we didn't follow that because God, like the number 40 means, was a day of, is a number meaning trial and testing. But that's important, brother, because you're going to run into people. And I ran into one recently when I was calling one gal's sister who was wanting to talk about that subject of Pentecost, by the way, and she became convinced that it should be on the first day of the week, Sunday. And that was after going with her father into a group he started as a minister, the one that went to Mr. Armstrong, interestingly, who broke off because of it and said, nope, it should stay on Monday. I was like, well, wait a minute. You went to him 20 years before I had the idea about it, telling him it should be on Sunday. And then now when he changes it to Sunday, 20-some years later, you're saying, no, it should be on Monday. Well, how did you flip? You went to him to tell him it should be on Sunday. You were convinced way ahead of time, but then you became unconvinced because they tied it in with divorce and remarriage. Well, anyway, whole nother issue. Let's get to this point about the recording. I'm sorry to hold you in such suspense, Dale, but we have 90 minutes for Bible study. It's saving the best for last. And not only the best, but also the thing that's perhaps the most potential for, what's the word I want to use, confrontation or disagreement or whatever. Because some disagree with Mr. Armstrong. This is not my teaching. I'm just holding fast to what God taught us through Mr. Armstrong. He taught us. First of all, it's going to be a 1956 recording. It's going to be kind of hard to hear a little bit, but I want to explain this simple chart beside me here. It says body of Christ with one sick human head. That refers to the human head after Mr. Armstrong died. Some years after, when he did a transformation, tried to transform the truth of God into a lie, so we wound up with a sick human head. And this is just prior to the scattering. And then what happens is we didn't just wind up with a bandaged leg. This next drawing really shouldn't even have a human head on it, because Jesus Christ is still the spiritual head of the body of Christ. But when I use this chart, we're talking about the human side of it, the human element. And so let me bring this forward for a moment. I'll just talk about it before we play Mr. Armstrong. All right. If I were to redesign this chart and make it more simple and easy to read and just plain and simpler, I would take the head off, because we're talking about the human aspect of the body of Christ. I'd take the human head off because we now have no human head. All right, I know there are a lot of ministers and groups that have formed groups out there that they claim they're the new hotshot from, the new replacement for Mr. Armstrong, as if the new pastor general, which they are not. And there is no new apostle. There's nobody who's shown the fruits, who God has showed the fruits of an apostle. So we don't have a human head. I mean, the one we did have as the pastor general, I mean, he's like cut his head off. He no longer claims that the assets and the organization that he acquired the leadership over is called the Church of God anymore. He's renamed it, something else that the initials GCI stands for. So where you see GCI out to the left of the top arm on the right side of the body, it's the left side of the screen, but that'd be the right side of the body. You see I've got that arm cut off from the body. So he's cut himself off from the body of Christ. The body of Christ is also known as the Church of God. And as an admission or as a sign of what they did, they're no longer part of the body of Christ. They're no longer even calling themselves Church of God. And I think most of us should be thankful they are not. But then all the other arms on there are a lot of other ministers who set up a lot of confusion by setting up groups that they've put an adjective on, calling it the banana peeling, blankety blank, this or that Church of God group. And I purposely didn't name any of them. I just put XCG on all the arms. And then there's some groups, there are groups out there that haven't come up with a name, and I put them on the legs as unarmed brethren who haven't joined any of these armed groups that have created new arms off the body of Jesus Christ, and each of those arms claiming to, be the head of the body. So the body has no human head, but it's got all these subheads, sub-chiefs, creating whole masses of, I could only put 6 on here on a graph, but I mean, those are to represent, each one's to represent several hundred, so that you wind up with what some people are telling me is over 1,000 blankety blank, this or that, named, nominated, denominated Church of God groups. All right, but let me come back with you, because here's the main point. Starting in 1956, you'll hear this in this recording, that I'm about to play in a few minutes. Where but now remember, it's going to be a 1956 recording. I don't even know if they had cassette tapes back that far. I think they did not. So whatever the recording method was, I don't think they were running barbed wire recordings then. I think they would have been running reel-to-reel tape recorders. But it's not the best audio, but if you listen carefully, you can hear what he says. And what I may do, for those of you that will be tuning back in with us for the Sabbath service in the morning, it'll still be the Sabbath in the morning, not a new day. It's Sabbath started at sunset tonight. Still part of the same day, but we're in the evening part of the Sabbath on God's calendar. Now, if you counterpose that with the calendar of man, the Roman calendar, they call this Friday night until midnight, and then it becomes Saturday as if it were a new day. It's not a new day. It's just the morning after the evening Sabbath. But we call it Friday night and Saturday morning. But in the morning, still Sabbath morning, for the Sabbath service, AM to the U.S., PM to the UK, I'll try to type out what Mr. Armstrong said, and we'll go through it again, and I'll have the words on the screen for you. I may stop it and repeat some of the things he says because of the clarity problem we may have with the recording. But if you listen carefully, I think you'll be able to understand Mr. Armstrong. I think not only was it an old recording, but it was also probably picked up off of somebody's microphone from the speakers in the hall. It doesn't seem to be a direct professional type of recording, so that's another reason why it's going to be a little hard to hear. But it's discernible. If you listen carefully, it's discernible what he's saying. Let's listen to him first, and then we'll go over what he said in 1956, and we'll compare that to what I can tell you and others who were there. There were over 1,000 people there in the early to mid 1980s when he said the same thing again with just a few different words that he said in this recording you're going to hear in 1956. But of course, it's in 1980, the name had been modified, changed, same corporation, but had been modified to worldwide instead of radio. But let's take it back to 56 when we were called Radio Church of God and hear Mr. Armstrong's instruction about how we shouldn't be calling ourselves members of the Radio Church of God. And as you hear this, keep in mind that what we're going to hear about in 1980 is how he told everybody we shouldn't be calling ourselves members of the worldwide Church of God. He made everybody put their hands down in 1980. Same thing he's saying in 1956, where you can hear his voice saying it. I haven't been able to find a recording of that Sabbath that he did that about the Worldwide Church of God, but I was there. I was ushering that day. I was even able to see people, because of my ushering position, I was able to see people's hands very clearly who raised them, and then he said, raise them high. And I was able to see whose hand, the number of hands not raised. And it was about half and half, roughly. But as he asked people to raise them higher, a few more raised their hands who didn't have their hands up. But there were still quite a number, almost half, who did not have their hands up, even after he asked people to shove them up high. Raise your hands high now if you're members of the Worldwide Church of God. Keep that in mind as you listen to this recording that I'm going to play from 1956. Now, I'll have to put a little audio player. I'm using the same computer that this slide is on, so I'm just going to have to roll that in front of that slide. That big note means that's a media player. And let's see. I'll need to cut off my mic while we play that, but I'm going to play it straight through, and then I think I'll play it again and pause it and make sure and repeat some of the words just in case the audio is not coming through as cleanly and clearly as I hope it will on our system. So let's start it from the beginning. Here's Mr. Armstrong speaking at a Feast of Tabernacles in 1956, asking brethren, what you're going to hear is asking brethren, how many of you are saying you're part of this Armstrong movement? Or I think he may even ask the question, how many of you are members of the radio, saying you're members of the Radio Church of God? Let's listen to him, and then I'll comment on it. Oh, friends, I had turned off my mic while I was just explaining that. I'm sorry about that. I hadn't started Mr. Armstrong yet. I was just explaining that the closed captions, because of the old recording, it may not be able to pick him up too good. But what I'll do is after we play it through one time, I'll watch that up there. If it's not as clear as we would like for it to be, then what I'll do is come back and play it again, and I'll repeat the words for those who are hard of hearing, so the closed caption thing will come out. Okay, all right, that's what I was trying to say when I had turned off the mic. All right, let's play Mr. Armstrong now.
And by the way, when anyone asks you, what church do you belong to? How many of you say, well, this Armstrong movement? How many of you do? How many of you say the Armstrong group? How many of you say you belong to the Church of God? That's more like it. This is God's church. Now, to all regular purposes, do not just say Radio Church of God. It's the Church of God. The corporate name is Radio Church of God, and that's only because others have the name Church of God that we feel didn't rightly belong to it. But nevertheless, the United States government gives us freedom of speech and religion, and we're glad they do, because we wouldn't have it if the others didn't have it too. And so, whether by divine right they have it or not, they have it. And they have it by legal right. And they have the name Church of God, and we couldn't use it. We had to qualify it, and so since our evangelistic work is put as the number one work of the church, as Christ said it, even ahead of our local church services, and since the biggest part of the evangelistic work was on the radio at the time, we were forced to use the name Radio Church of God. Now, to be technical and legal, it's the Radio Church of God. But from a spiritual point of view, it's just the Church of God. Now, if anyone says, oh, you're a member of this Church of God over here so-and-so, or Anderson, Indiana, or some other place, then you have to say, no, we have no connection with them. Our corporate name is Radio Church of God. You can say that. But don't ever tell them you're one of Herbert Armstrong's followers, but you're one of Jesus Christ's followers. All right.
Okay, brethren, it ended right there. Now, before I comment too much further, well, I'm going to put some comments in between. I'm going to, as you noticed, the closed captions, they just more or less stopped while we were playing that, because the audio, it usually interprets Mr. Armstrong fairly correctly. In fact, it may sometimes create closed captions better for him than it does for me. I see I'm going to need to change this mic, I think, because it's not doing as well for me tonight for some reason as it usually does. But I'm going to play Mr. Armstrong again. I'm going to repeat his words every so often for those of you who are just reading closed captions because of being hard of hearing. And maybe some of the rest of you, because the recording's not that good, maybe didn't quite hear it all as well as you would have liked to. And I do want to insert some comments where I have some facts about who has the name Church of God and when they incorporated it and why we couldn't use it, like Mr. Armstrong was saying, why we couldn't make the business name, the corporate name, to be simply Church of God, because somebody else, as of 1922, already incorporated that, a group that goes back to the Sardis era. and I'll read a scripture about how, from Revelation 2, about how, you have a name, that you're alive, but you're as dead as a doorknob. Well, I'm paraphrasing that verse. We'll read it exactly in a moment. But all right, you heard him, but the basis of what you heard him saying was, and let's repeat it so we get the words exact. Let's play this again about, don't be saying you're part of the Armstrong movement. And he also said it in a certain way. He was also saying don't use the corporate term, the business name, saying you're a member of the Radio Church of God. Let's do this again.
And by the way, when anyone asks you, what church do you belong to? How many of you say, well, this Armstrong movement? How many of you do?
All right, you see, just like he did in 1980, he starts out in 1956 saying, how many of you, when you're asked what church you belong to, do you say you're part of the Armstrong movement? So he starts out with that because it sounds like hit the mic. It sounds like in 1956, people, by the thousands who attended those Feast of Tabernacles in Big Sandy, perhaps were responding to people, what church are you in? Oh, well, I'm part of the Armstrong movement. That seems like maybe that was a common vernacular of the day, perhaps, from the way he was talking in 1956. But let's go on, because he's going to address the name that was the corporate name then, Radio Church of God. And you'll hear his words about how he says, don't say you're members of, he's essentially saying, don't say you're members of that either. Let's go on from here.
How many of you say the Armstrong group?
All right, he simply changed it from Armstrong movement to the Armstrong group. Let's go further.
How many of you say you belong to the Church of God?
All right, then he asked a simple question. How many of you say you belong to the Church of God? And that's when you saw me a moment ago raise my hand. Yeah, I'd raise my hand to that. Yay, all right. Now listen, he's gonna say that's the correct answer. Listen.
That's more like it. This is God's church. Now, to all regular purposes, do not just say Radio Church of God. It's the Church of God.
All right, right there is where he says in 1956, brethren, don't be saying you're members of the Radio Church of God. Even though at that time, equivalent to a later time when radio was changed to worldwide, the same principle applies. When he said it in 1981 expressly with worldwide, he said, none of you have ever been members of the worldwide Church of God. It's a non-member corporation. He's basing that on the same exact instruction he gave in 1956, where he said, don't be saying you're members of the Radio Church of God. Just say Church of God, period. Now, before we go further, I want to address some of you, especially some of you who love when I put a posting on my personal private Facebook page where I say, hey, our recording for Sabbath service today is going to be in the archive over here because either I had to be late or I goofed up or the sound went wacko or whatever, and I'm explaining something, and then people come in and say, well, if you want an alternative Sabbath service, go over to the XYZ Church of God. They do this on my post. Well, as soon as I see them, guess what? Dink, there's a nice delete button there. Zap, zoom, boom. Some people have been obstinate. I've had to change their friendship to simply an acquaintance because then they can't stick that stuff on my post. And then they don't see my stuff either. So I'm saying, look, if you're offended because I'm telling people, that are friends of mine that may want to know what happened on my service thing, I let them know on my page. And if that comes in on your page and you don't like it, well, you can hit your delete button, or you can ignore it or whatever you want to do. But don't come on top of my post saying there's an alternative XYZ splinter group service over here you can listen to. That's the rudest thing in the world one of the rude things a person can do. And I'm going to end your rudeness by just deleting it. You do that on my page as soon as I see it. You might get a little time and a little exposure. And you're doing it in an arena where a lot of people who listen to me agree with me and understand by God's Spirit that I'm not preaching something on my own. I'm telling you, I'm holding fast to what God's end-time apostle instructed us. And I'm giving you an actual recording here where you can hear him in 1956 expressing the principles that I have told many of you, and I've been unable to find a recording. I'd pay $100 or more for the recording if one existed. Not to everybody, but the first one of you that finds one and sends it to me, I'd be glad to send you $100 for the recording from 1980. But I know I have many fellow witnesses, people who were there with me in that auditorium. I'm not the only one who heard Mr. Armstrong say this. He didn't say it to me privately. He said it in a Sabbath service. How many of you are members of the Worldwide Church of God? Raise them high now if you're members of the world. And he said Worldwide Church of God. And then he said, put your hands down. None of you have ever been members of the Worldwide Church of God. I looked carefully at you to see if any of you here have ever been on the board of directors. He said, only if you've ever been on the board of directors, one of the 12 board of directors, then you were a member of the Worldwide Church of God. Its board of directors are the only members. It is otherwise, by its bylaws, by its articles of incorporation, it is a non-member corporation. Now, that's the corporation, the business name. And it goes back to the principle he was saying, just say you're the Church of God. You know, if people would follow that principle, we wouldn't have brethren out there arguing with one another about how my XYZ Church of God group is better than your ABC Church of God group, or your DEF or GHI or LMNOP Church of God group. I'm specifically avoiding the exact names of any of them, but you've heard the dozens and hundreds of names. Many of you have. There's certain ones that are bigger than others, so their names are prominent. Their names are the Magnified Church of God group. I've never heard of anybody calling their group the Magnified Church of God. I'm just picking on a name to say, look, there are some groups that have a lot of people that call themselves members of that group. But if you listen to the principle here that Mr. Armstrong is giving you, he said we shouldn't have even been calling ourselves members of the Radio Church of God when we were significantly one body before we became split or scattered. Before we became scattered, we were basically one body. And even then, God's apostle was saying we shouldn't be calling ourselves members of the corporate name. And we had to pick that name. We had to, as he'll say in a moment, we had to qualify it. Let me go further just a little bit, and I'll stop again after he says that point.
The corporate name is Radio Church of God, and that's only because others have the name Church of God that we feel didn't rightly belong to it.
Okay, good point. Spiritually, didn't rightly belong. Those who had the name corporately, the business name Church of God, he says, they didn't feel they rightly had it. And that's based on Scripture. If we go to Revelation, I only have a few minutes, got to do this quick. We'll pick up more in the morning, but let's go to Revelation 2 to talk about those who have the name legally, but they, in the records of the United States, but they don't rightfully have it. They don't have it spiritually right. And I should have said chapter 3. Let's go to chapter 3 of Revelation. Right in the first chapter where God says, and then to the angel of the church in Sardis, write, these things saith he which has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. Now he's addressing the church in Sardis, the era just before Philadelphia. I know and on the mail route before Sardis, but for our time today, we recognize that this is a chronological thing as well. I know, to Sardis, he says, I know your works, that you have a name, that you live. Yeah, they've got the name, even legally, rightly or wrongly, they got the name legally, but wrongly because that verse goes on and says, you have a name that you live, but you're dead, and art dead, it says here. You got the name that you're alive, but you're dead. So you're hypocrites. You got the name, but you don't deserve the name. because you got the name like you're alive, but you're dead. You got the name Church of God, but you're not. The Church of God really, especially since the Philadelphia era has come on the scene. Okay, and where God goes on and says, "Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die, for I have not found your works perfect before God." So the organization that has the legal business name, the legal corporate name, Church of God, God says about them, "I've not found your works perfect before God." And God goes on, verse 3, "Remember, therefore, how you received and heard, and hold fast, and repent," he tells that church. If therefore you shall not watch, I'll come on you as a thief, and you shall not know what hour I'll come upon you, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so there's a big warning to those who have a name like they're alive, and they've even got that name legally. Now, let me give you just a few quick facts. I know it's in 1 minute to go, but I hope you won't mind if I go a couple of 3 minutes over, just so I can address this, and then we'll pick up with this in the morning further. But here's who has the organization. Some of you might like to know this. The organization who has the name legally, business name, corporate name, tied up corporately, is a group out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Here's the history, a little history blurb on it for you. The parenthesis, original Church of God, as they word it themselves, they put original in parentheses. The original, in parentheses, Church of God shares a common origin and history with the Church of God Cleveland and several other Christian bodies named Church of God. The parenthesis, original Church of God Incorporated came into being in 1917 when the Church of God in Chattanooga, Tennessee, led by Joseph L. Scott, separated from the Cleveland-based church. The body's use of original in parenthesis reflects the belief that it is the true, reflects the belief that it is true to the original faith, purpose, and practice of the Church of God movement. Well, it started out that way, but then God says, "I know your works, and you've become dead." You got the name like you're alive, but you're dead. The Church of God, incorporated in 1922, this Chattanooga, Tennessee thing, incorporated in 1922. Ridgedale Theological Seminary was founded in 1925, part of that organization's seminary, college, seminary, theological seminary college. Okay, so there's who's got it. The business name, Church of God, Chattanooga, Tennessee, led by Joseph L. Scott. After he separated from the Cleveland-based church, he was able to incorporate it and grab off and lock up the name as of 1922, Church of God. And that was about 4 years before God began to work with Mr. Armstrong in 1926. So even just 4 years before God's calling Mr. Armstrong, this group locked up the simple, plain name Church of God in a corporate form. So, as Mr. Armstrong says, we had to qualify it.
But nevertheless, the United States government gives us freedom of speech and religion, and we're glad they do, because we wouldn't have it if the others didn't have it too. And so, whether by divine right they have it or not, they have it. And they have it by legal right. And they have the name Church of God, and we couldn't use it. We had to qualify it, and so since our evangelistic work is put as the number one work of the church, as Christ said it, even ahead of our local church services, and since the biggest part of the evangelistic work was on the radio at the time, we were forced to use the name Radio Church of God.
All right, Mr. Armstrong is explaining there why he had to qualify. In other words, qualify means put an adjective or modifier onto the name Church of God. Why he had to qualify it with an adjective as Radio Church of God, since that was, as he was saying there that was the number one work they were doing, that the work was doing at that time, radio. So that was a natural shoe-in, a natural adjective to use with Church of God for incorporating, since he could not incorporate simply as Church of God, because this organization out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, that broke away from Cleveland already had incorporated as Church of God. So that was tied up. The business name was tied up as Church of God. So the qualifier, the adjective, radio, Church of God. But Mr. Armstrong, as you heard him at the beginning of this, said, brother, don't be telling people you're members of the radio Church of God. That's just the corporate business name. And that's a physical, asset-related thing. What you're members of, what you were baptized into, which he especially said in 1980, was you weren't baptized into the blankety-blank, some denomination, the radio Church of God. You were baptized into the body of Christ, a.k.a., also known as, simply, the Church of God, a spiritual organism, not a physical organization, not a building. We got to sign off, friends. I'll be back in the morning. Dale, I hope you're hearing that recording was good for you and helpful. There's a little bit more of it. I'll just let it play as we sign off here for tonight's Bible study. I know it gets rough and undistinguishable a little bit, but I'll just play it out, and then I'm going to sign off, and we'll maybe pick up again in the morning here.
Now, to be technical and legal, it's the radio Church of God. But from a spiritual point of view, it's just the Church of God. Now, if anyone says, oh, you're a member of this Church of God over here, so-and-so, or Anderson, Indiana, or some other place, then you have to say, no, we have no connection with them. Our corporate name is Radio Church of God. You can say that.
All right. Mr. Armstrong was saying you could explain back at that time, 1956, that if somebody was confused when you say I'm a member of the Church of God, and they say, oh, you're a member of this one or that one that incorporated in Cleveland or in Chattanooga or some other place, because they know of some other Church of God incorporated some other place. He said, you'll have to say, no, the organization I'm affiliated with is the Radio Church of God. You could say that, but he didn't want us saying or thinking even that we were members of that corporation. But just to clarify for people, then if they brought up some other Church of God organization, you could say, no, this is incorporated as this name, but not say you're a member of it. Did you get it? He definitely expressly said that, and in principle, and especially as he repeated it about the worldwide Church of God. Both lay members and ministers who set up these many banana-peeling, blankety-blank Church of God groups. Banana-peeling, the adjective is the banana-peeling of the parts of speech. So when I say banana-peeling Church of God groups, that means they put modifiers, they put adjectives in front of Church of God, following, in a way, what Mr. Armstrong did when we were one body, but now that we're scattered, that makes confusion. It was appropriate, it was fitting when we were one body to have a corporate Church of God with a modifier that people could understand. The Church of God in the Philadelphia era is either the radio or later the Worldwide Church of God corporation for its assets and its organization. But the Philadelphia era Church of God as a spiritual organism, plain and simple. Lay members and ministers alike who, if you would listen to God's end-time apostles saying, don't be saying you're members of the Radio Church of God. None of you were ever members of the Worldwide Church of God. Put your hands down, all of you who raised your hands. You should know from those things that we should not be saying we're members of a blankety-blank this or a blankety-blank that, XYZ, ABC, LMNOP, blankety-blank Church of God group here and there. Brethren, I'll see you in the morning. That's it for our Friday night Bible study. Thanks for joining me. I hope you got some edifying help from this. We'll pick up with it a little bit in the morning. Until the morning, I hope you have a good, refreshing night's sleep. And get some thanks and prayer in before the eternal. Thank him for his mercy, for giving us time to repent of things we all, you and me, both of us, me and you and me, all of us, need to be repenting of and putting out of our lives, and putting some things into our lives, like obeying the instruction in Luke 21, verse 36. We'll talk about that in the morning, too. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for joining me tonight, brethren. Happy Sabbath. See you, those of you who joined me, see you in the morning in the U.S. and the afternoon in the U.K. and elsewhere related to those times around the world. Happy Sabbath. Shabbat Shalom. Good night for now. Happy Sabbath, everybody. Good night for now.